When there's nothing on TV, you can always watch YouTube, sometimes take in an old movie, maybe watch the most recent documentary, and you can learn lots of interesting stuff like how to repair engines or operate a sewing machine maybe. Not so long ago I saw a very interesting documentary about a woman who lived in Ireland and had inherited a croft. In the croft, she said everything was handed down from her father and to her father from his father. But she also said that at age 15, she had been taken out of school to look after the croft. And for that reason, she had never received the free public school state education. I thought, hang on a moment, that sounds familiar. I didn't inherit any croft, but I never received the free basic state education either. That is because my father was ex-signalman in the Royal Navy and he wanted me to join the Navy. So just before I was 15 I left school and he took me along to the Navy recruitment office in Aberdeen. They then sent me for a medical test in Arbroath, who declared that I was medically unfit because I was colourblind. So the next thing he did was take me back to Aberdeen again and to the Army Recruitment Office, which was right next door to the Navy office. And then I found myself enlisted in the Army as a boy soldier, Junior Leaders Regiment, Royal Signals, Newton Abbot, Devon. And so off I went on the train. And it took me about 1 month to get out of that. I mean, after all, I'm not a 15-year-old boy who had an inborn desire to be a signalman, or as it happened to be, a radio operator in the army. I was brought up in Fraserburgh, a small fishing port about 40 miles north of Aberdeen, where my father was Coast Guard. I remember mostly walking along the long sandy beach with hot summers, but terrible winters with ice and snow, etc. And also spending a lot of time around the harbour and also dodging the waves which would shoot up high in the sky over the breakwater and hoping not to get washed into the sea. About that time I also became interested in photography. I went along to a local camera shop asking for a job, but there was none. However, the proprietor, Mr. Bonowski, if I recall, very kindly gave me a 2 1/4 square folding camera, an Agfa, and after that I would be round the harbour taking pictures of the fishing boats. At that time there was a small inshore fleet of wooden boats and a fleet of seine netters and herring drifters and the like. So I would take the pictures, someone taught me how to develop and print the photos, I would print them up, and at Christmas I would make them into calendars, take them along to the local newsagents and sell them for whatever the going rate I could get. And that was my introduction to photography. So it was back to Scotland and a couple of other odd jobs before joining the Navy canteen service. That lasted about 1.5 years, mostly on board HMS Fearless, which sailed from Portsmouth, Plymouth and Brest, and we even had a go at invading Wales, and I was allowed to ride in one of the landing craft that was going ashore at the time. Then it was back to Scotland again, and another couple of jobs, this time in hotels in the Scottish Highlands, before joining the Royal Air Force at age about 18.5. That lasted for about 6.5 years, starting as plotter air photo as they called it, and then becoming a photographic interpreter. And then one day we had to go for a medical test down in London, and the Air Commodore specialist told me I was colourblind and that might affect my prospects in the RAF. So shortly afterwards I decided to leave and take my chances looking for a job in Civvy Street, as they called it at the time. Sailing and boating. I shall start with sailing and boating because at the time I left the Air Force I owned a 36-foot Broads river cruiser called Jupiter and lived aboard that for 3 years altogether. I sailed it along the waterways from Huntingdon, where it was based originally, up the river and arrived at Cambridge, and here in this picture is seen down at Clayhythe. A few years later I had another boat, a small Estelita it was called, a senior 23 called Estelita, a lovely little boat with a beautiful wooden interior. Afterwards I ended up with the boat I have now, this is many years later of course, which is a Hurley 9.5, a lovely yacht, a motor sailor, but it was in need of some repair, and in fact I'm still working on it at this moment as it needs an engine. And it's needed an engine for the past 8 years now, never mind. Here we have a clip from a film. It's called Cozy Interior. It shows you the inside of the boat in a stormy night in the marina where it is berthed in Spain. Another similar little movie I made, and that is a while back now, is Saloon and Rebuilt Galley, Hurley 9.5, and you can find both of these little movies on YouTube. Exploration. I think it was way back in about 1978 that I became interested in studying the origins of ancient measurement systems, particularly the cubits, such as the cubits of the Bible. And I came across a story by a Greek philosopher called Plato about Atlantis, which mentioned a level rectangular plane which measured 3,000 by 2,000 Greek stades, a stade being a unit of 600 Greek feet. I had also read that Atlantis could have been America or South America, so I systematically searched all of the Americas for a place where this rectangular plane might fit in. And this turned out to be a region of Bolivia called the Bolivian Altiplano, except that it wasn't a Greek stade, it was about half a Greek stade or half a furlong, which is sometimes also called an Assyrian stade or a Sumerian stade of 200 cubits. Now, at that time, the mapping available was not very good. I only had a very small Phillips School Atlas. So I went down to Stanford's in London, the big mapping shop, and I bought some United States Air Force charts, aeronautical charts, and these had marked on them every contour of elevation at 1,000-foot intervals. I then began to trace out all these contours and cut them out in polystyrene foam, then built them up level by level with a little bit of exaggeration for the altitude to give the right impression, until I had built a model of the region. And then when it was that I came to the 13,000-foot level, the rectangular feature of the plane stood out very well, and thus it was at that moment I thought I had discovered the level rectangular plane of Atlantis. I went on to finish the model by covering it in modelling clay and then painting it in appropriate colours and hollowing out the inside and covering the whole thing in fiberglass to make it transportable. Back when I started this, there were only very, very small scale Landsat photos available, and you couldn't really see very much on those. So I got on a plane and went out to Bolivia and went to the National Institute Geográfico Militar, as it's called, and I got some actual aerial photographs of the zone, which is to the west of Lake Popo, where I thought I had seen what looked like a giant perimeter canal that Plato talked about in their desert there. So the next thing after that was to rent a jeep and drive out to this region and see if I could find it on the ground. At that time I didn't have any GPS and I was just navigating using United States aeronautical charts. So I drove along what I thought was the nearest road to the area. After we crossed about 3 streams, I told the driver, turn left, we drove across some sandy dunes, and there before us was what appeared to be Plato's channel, this vast canal, what Plato described a channel so large that it was impossible for anyone to believe that it could have been made by men. And so it turned out to be, and people said, well, no, it wasn't a canal, it was a fault line. But others, such as the geologist who had made the maps of the region, he said, no, it wasn't a fault line, it was actually probably a canal or something like that. And it could well be that they have natural features, such as fault lines or something, and in the base of these fault line type channels, they have natural wells where the underground water comes up, even in the midst of the dry season. So it would be quite logical to build some sort of canal that could connect some of these natural wells together, and the canal which ran round the plain would carry off the surplus water in the wet season and provide irrigation and in the dry season. So I wrote up all my Atlantis theory and made it into a book. And of course it was very difficult to get any book published in those days until I was invited onto a radio program by Colonel John Blashford Snell, the famous explorer. And as a result of that interview, I had an offer by Windrush Press to publish my book, Atlantis, the Andes Solution. So it was published in English in England and also in the United States, and also in Spanish in Mexico, and I think maybe in Poland or Italy and some other places as well. After that, I had the opportunity to visit Bolivia again with some recce expeditions for one or two TV companies, and also with the Discovery Channel, and we made a movie which was called Atlantis in the Andes. That was filmed in 1999, I think it was, and came out in the year 2000. Following on from that, I went back to the region several times, sometimes paying for the expeditions myself and sometimes being sponsored. For example, the University of Oruro invited me to go there, and they wanted me to promote the area for tourism. But in these extra expeditions, I was able to look for additional features, which of course I couldn't do in one quick trip to Bolivia. It takes a lot of study to identify places on the ground and then get a jeep and go and check them out on site. One such feature, Plato talks about a system, a grid kind of system of canals and a grid pattern, and I could see something like this in an area north of La Paz. So I went there with my friend Porfirio Limachi, the famous reed boat builder of Bolivia, and we found this pattern of canals on the ground. They were, of course, much smaller than Plato's 100-foot wide canals, but they did prove that the things Plato talked about, irrigation canals and a checkerboard pattern, these are typical features of the area in Bolivia. Other times, we would drive across the level plain itself. This is the area next to Lake Popo, and the part in this video is called the Salar de Coipasa. There are two salars, one to the north called Coipasa and the other to the south called Salar de Uyuni, which is a popular tourist destination. In fact, we became so familiar with the area that it became a bit of a picnic going there. Well, picnic for me, but not for other people. However, you could see, and you still can see today on Google imagery, that there are in fact canals in the area. And although it has been popular for everybody to say no canals, only fault lines, you can see here quite clearly that canals are definitely a feature of the Bolivian landscape in this area.
We've arrived! This place is unreal! I can't believe we're here!
It's like hot springs.
This is what we call Ojos De Agua. Usually in Spanish, every place where there are springs, we call it ojos. But this place is not actually springs.
Anytime I see something bubbling out of the earth, I just assume it's hot. But this is actually cold. It's very confusing. So these holes go all the way down to the underground rivers, and it's just the oxygen coming up from the river flowing beneath the surface.
So there we have some of the cold springs which Plato talked about on the level plain, quite popular with tourists these days. And here we have my Indiana Jones moment, standing on the mountain at Pampa Llagas, the Atlantis mountain. I have a few film clips and they show the concentric rings of land. Of course there is no water today. The volcano has probably risen in elevation, or put another way, the surrounding plain has been shaken down by earthquakes and has dropped in elevation. Besides, today the nearby sea, which would have filled the rings with water, has completely dried up. But this site is quite unique, and it is the only site, the only proposed Atlantis site in the world, which has concentric rings of land and formerly water. I don't think we can count the site in the Sahara Desert, because that is not really corresponding to all the details that Plato gave, and is way too large. It's 27 miles in diameter, larger than the entire greater city of metropolis London. But here on the Altiplano is a very beautiful and highly defensible site, which is what Plato described, with concentric rings of land and concentric channels now filled with sandy earth. And there are a lot of fallen down stones on the site, but it's very difficult to find stones cut in the manner that we would expect them to be cut. Usually they're just cut on one face. But this block here, if this block had been at Tiwanaku, say, that would have been recognised as a cut stone. But in Pampa Llagas, well, not many people are really paying attention to it. However, as a result of the various work I did with the book and the expeditions and the promotion of tourism in the area, the Technical University of Oruro awarded me a Doctor Honoris Causa, and also I participated with them in some talks and expeditions with people of UNESCO. At other times, people in the area would show to me things that they wouldn't show to other people, such as a private museum of what is called black ceramics from Tiwanaku, and these large skulls, these clay skulls, look like something out of a futuristic movie, Next Prophet of Doom perhaps, who knows. There are other interesting things to be seen on the Altiplano. There are chulpas, which are ancient burial tombs, and also many ringed hill forts, such as this one here, which has concentric rings, mostly fallen down, rings of stone fallen down today. Anyway, most of those things have been written up, and I made them into another series of YouTube movies called Atlantis Bolivia, The Evidence Revisited. There are always interesting things to look at in Bolivia. This picture, for example, is not in Bolivia. This is at Chanquillo in Peru, where it has a kind of hill fort with concentric rings, walls around it, and that is considered to be a type of observatory. The next photo is a site in Bolivia near a place called Sica Sica, which I doubt if many other people have actually been to. It is virtually the same size as the site in Chanquillo, Peru. It has two concentric ring walls around it, and it has a very, very ancient look in an area which looks on Google Earth to have been hit by earthquakes. Other interesting sites exist for potential future visits, such as this remains of a temple which exists on an island in the river Desaguadero near Lake Titicaca, and I would be interested to see this place on site because the famous Bolivian archaeologist Poznański measured it, and I'm interested to see how his measurements check out, and if they check out to any ancient known systems of measurement, whether in Bolivia or elsewhere in the world. More recent discoveries on the area west of Lake Titicaca is an area where there are concentric rings of land and water, a bit like Plato described it, but of course much smaller channels. These are known as suku colus, and they have been visited today by some boys from Bolivia who shot some amazing footage. Of course, I should have said there, boys from Peru, not from Bolivia, because it is located on the Peruvian side of Lake Titicaca, not far over the border from Bolivia. All the same, these lads did an excellent job to go and investigate this site and make quite a comprehensive little video of it, which they posted on YouTube. These features, called sucacoyos, they have embankments for growing the crops, and between the embankments they have channels for water. And because the area gets quite cold at the night time, these channels full of water would have retained the heat from the sun and given off the heat in the night time, therefore leading to increased crop production. In fact, Plato said that in Atlantis they cropped land twice per year. And where these type of sucacoyos have been restored near Tiwanaku, researchers found that they could increase the crop production by perhaps 2 or 3 times compared to what they may normally have achieved. So here we have once more a feature very similar to what Plato described for agriculture being found on the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia. One of very many similarities between the Americas and the story of Atlantis, where it would seem the description was borrowed from a description of the ancient Americas. Much, of course, has changed since the times of the conquest, since the people were taken off the land and made to work in the mines on plantations for the Spanish, and all these ancient marvels of engineering were simply just abandoned. Round about the year 2000 and in the years just afterwards, a series of underwater expeditions were carried out by an Italian international research group called ACACOR. They found beneath the waters of the lake the remains of submerged terrace walls. Also, the remains of what was described as a temple, said to be 660 feet in length, which just happens to be 1 furlong or 1 Sumerian stade. Then, fairly recently, the year now being 2020, another expedition underwater was made by the famous modern-day archaeologist called Josh Gates. He found what he called multiple buildings down here. And these photographs were taken by Eduardo Montaño of Atlantis Bolivia, who went out in a rowing boat and rowed across the lake at the time of the solstice, one of the great Aymara celebrations in Bolivia. So there we have it, the remains of a submerged city underneath Lake Titicaca. And that should not come too much as a surprise, because in Bolivia there is a very old legend called the Legend of the Desiguadero, which talks of a culture, a people who lived in happiness on the edge of the lake. But after a period of time, their greed and bad habits got the better of them, and the gods decided to punish them. Thereafter, the gods sent floods and earthquakes and sank their city beneath the waters of the nearby Lake Titicaca, and that is what has been found today. So, could it be that this story of the city submerged beneath the lake, that's to say beneath this very large sea, is the story which found its way to Egypt, and from Egypt to Greece, and became the origin of Plato's story of Atlantis? I have, in the Krillin Tours complex on the site at Watahata, on the edges of Lake Titicaca, a small Atlantis museum built in one of the Uru huts, which Darius Morgan, the proprietor, built specially for me. Painting. I began painting over 40 years ago now. I started by painting copies of old masters as a means of having something to hang on the wall, and then began painting from my own photographs. And the paintings are a bit of a life story in themselves. However, they were all stored in a friend's attic in Cambridge. The friend got a bit old and bit mental case, I don't know what happened, and gave all my personal effects that were stored there away. However, that is going to be the subject of a separate movie which will be called The Lost Paintings of J.M. Allen. I have also been keen on making models, and here is a model of the giant, well, 100-foot long reed ship, as it's meant to be, built out of reeds in Bolivia and based on the designs of Noah's Ark as stated in the Bible. We had plans to maybe build a smaller version of this by my reed boat builder friend Porfirio Lamachi in Lake Titicaca, and he did get as far as making one model, but without my supervision it didn't come out exactly as I had planned, and it was really more of the traditional reed boat. Music. My mother could play the piano, the accordion, the violin, and the mandolin, and the accordion as well. Unfortunately, she never gave me any music lessons. I guess my father thought, well, boys don't play the piano. However, once upon a time when I worked in an hotel in Scotland, a retired music teacher came into the bar, and his name was Mr. Moffat, and I got him to give me a few basic lessons on how to play the piano. A few years later, I passed a little bit of that knowledge on to a friend in Cambridge who thought, well, it was too difficult, he would never ever be able to play the piano. So for him, I invented a system called the Easy Read system, where the music sheet actually looks like the piano keyboard. And he took a look at that and immediately started playing the piano. Unfortunately, he then decided he'd go off and have private piano lessons. So I actually published a few of these books, but there was a recession in England at that time, so like all publishing efforts, never really sold many of them. Writing, publishing, and self-publishing. My name is Jim Allen, and I am the author of a book called Atlantis, the Andes Solution, and various other books about the site of Atlantis in Bolivia in South America. I first self-published a little booklet called Atlantis, the City and the Plain in 1980, setting out the very elementary theory of Atlantis in Bolivia. I typed it up on a golf ball typewriter and had printed off 1,000 copies, thinking you keep the price down by sort of mass production. That was a big mistake. In fact, I only sold about, if I'm lucky, between 50 and 100 copies, and ended up with what the publishers call loads of extra copies stored under the bed. It was quite a while before I got my major book published, Atlantis, the Andes Solution. That was in 1998, I think it was. It was followed up at the suggestion of a senator from Oruro called Miguel Vargas that I should make some other books about the Atlantis site in Bolivia to help them out with tourism and just out of interest in the country. So I followed up with another book called The Atlantis Trail, the story of my expeditions around the Altiplano, and that was followed up by a third book called Atlantis, Lost Kingdom of the Andes, which detailed my findings at the site at Pampaliagas. A fourth book came along, Atlantis and the Persian Empire, relating how certain aspects in Bolivia were similar to those in ancient Persia, particularly the round-ringed city of Atlantis, which was similar to the description of Ecbatana and Susa in ancient Persia. The rights of Atlantis, the Andes Solution, and Atlantis, Lost Kingdom of the Andes eventually reverted back to myself. So these books, along with all the other books and the series and a few other books, life story and some other things about boating and whatever, are now published by myself in Amazon and also through Kindle books. I remember the replies from the publishers in the old days. Thank you so much for being so kind as to think of us, but your book doesn't fit our list, and we wish you luck in placing your book elsewhere. Fortunately, today people can publish by themselves through Amazon or other print-on-demand publishers, as they call it, or through Kindle. Unfortunately, with print on demand, the books being printed one at a time turn out to be rather expensive, especially in colour. And with Kindle, they're a bit difficult to program if you have a lot of illustrations, as the system was originally designed for novels, just printed words. But at least it is an opportunity for those who are prepared to study the system and do it themselves. I think it was one of the great philosophers, possibly even Plato himself, who said that there can be no progress in arts and sciences unless people have leisure time. Meaning, of course, that a person can't be a painter or writer or write poetry or make sculpture if they're busy filling up the shelves in the supermarket all the time, or have to dedicate their life mostly going to work in some mundane job. That is why people need sponsorship and why people today have invented websites like Patreon, where people can fund people who are actively doing something. Most of these seem to be people, for example, sailing around in boats, young couples, and making a video blog once or twice a week to keep the membership up. But the point is there that, for example, I made a total of 8 expeditions, that is to say 8 trips, different trips to Bolivia. The longest stay was 8 months. Well, the biggest problem, of course, was that there was no funding, except for once I had a contribution from Samuel Doria Medina, the cement manufacturing politician man, and other times a bit of help from film companies and the Uto University or whatever. But fundamentally, without a permanent income and a dependable income, and without a permanent base, for example, in Bolivia, it was very difficult to stay any lengthy period of time. And so it always meant coming back to England, and which is why I bought the boat, which I've been busy with now, to have a base which actually belongs to me instead of belonging to someone else, and with the option of someone to either to tell you to leave or go a bit crazy and throw your personal effects away. So that's my little line about the patronage system and so forth, which of course has existed over centuries. Even the great Mozart himself didn't do very well, and unfortunately was buried in a pauper's grave. But that's an unhappy note to end on. So talk about maybe Van Gogh and something bright and colourful in future, or with the next round of movies.